Okay, so today marks the continuation process for the 2014 to kick off planning, and I anticipate just to recap last month. Expenditures that we anticipate operating year. You have of Mr. Henson's summary sheet that recaps, but those expenditures that we're anticipating for next year. Inflationary adjustments, which happen every year. In fact, they've gone a little bit down. But, you know, they may go up. Again, revenue. Plan for something else. New revenues. You know, we could have on our hands big numbers. This meeting is about surfacing potential solutions or categories of potential solutions. I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Henson in a minute, but to illustrate the challenge that we've got, I've put together a slide. And yes, I'm sorry Dr. Gentry isn't here to chastise me for bringing a PowerPoint, but the good news is it's only one slide, and let me say yes.
Well, then you would win.
Yes, I have mad PowerPoint skills. So let's kind of look at where we're headed at an analysis. This is basically a graphic depiction of what's on the summary sheet that Mr. Henson has prepared for us. The blue block represents the employee compensation changes at the top of the summary sheet. The yellow block at the top of that column represents the series of proposed changes at the bottom of the page, including the TFA contract, raise to the top related positions, and other items. And the red block in the middle represents the so-called required additions in the middle of the page, including the outlays that we'll have to make for charter to accommodate charter growth. In that red block, of course, that's the biggest part. That's where we've got the most challenges and perhaps the most opportunities. To put it in perspective, about 89% of that block, or about 23 million, everything below that dotted line is to fund charter growth, new schools and growth in existing schools. So that is our charter growth column. In the meantime, the column on the right is anticipated new revenue. So again, to be conservative, we're assuming 2% revenue growth. Like what we're experiencing this year. Maybe it ends up being 3% or more, but for now, we're going to be conservative. So we've got a potential gap that amounts to about $23 million right now. So I want to reiterate, we're still 7 or 8 months out from having to make final decisions. We've got time to work on this, but I think now is the time to plan accordingly, talk about where we've got the political will to make adjustments or cuts and not end up scrambling when the time comes. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Henson to talk us through some options, but first, any questions or comments about the high-level math here? Seeing none, Mr. Henson, you want to take it from here?
Sure, and I'm going to stick with the first item on the agenda and just discuss into a little more detail regarding the document that you have, that summary of changes document. And I know I've probably said this before, but just want to be sure to reiterate if I have. This does not include any across-the-board pay raise. This includes step increases for both groups of employees, certificated employees and our support employees. You can see at the bottom of the page what the cost would be to give a 1% across-the-board pay raise if that's something we're looking at. It also does not include any potential changes in pension costs. All of our certificated employees are part of the state retirement plan, the Tennessee Consolidated Retirement System. We don't know what that's a defined benefit plan. We don't know what that employer contribution rate will be until the state tells us what it will be. And so we don't have anything in here for any potential changes to pension costs for either our certificated employees or our support employees. Our support employees' pension or all of their benefits are under the jurisdiction of the Metro Employee Benefit Board, and the Employee Benefit Board has not yet determined what that employer contribution rate would be for that particular defined benefit plan. So I wanted to make sure that you understood that there are still, as Mr. Pinkston said, several things outstanding here. You know, we're in early September, and so we're not going to have all of our information or all of our data yet to be able to put forth anything better than the best estimate that you have in front of you. I do also want to point out in the middle of the page the inflationary increases, just to remind you of what those are. Basically, those are utility cost increases and where the utility rates increase, and insurance cost increases. The majority of our insurance costs come to us from Metro government. We're a part of Metro government as far as the insurance costs, buildings and contents insurance, general liability insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And those costs typically do increase each year. And so that's the majority of what the inflationary increases are: utility cost increases and Metro insurance cost increases. I do want to point out that we show some reduction for Cameron, as in 14-15 or next year, Cameron will be fully charterized under Lead Academy. We will no longer have an MNPS portion as we do this year. This year it's just the 8th grade is MNPS, and grades 5 through 7 are Lead Charter School, but after this year it will be fully charter. And also I do want to point out that included in that charter school number, well, actually what you won't see on here would be any increase for projected student enrollment growth. That would be because the projected student numbers for 14-15 show that there would be an increase of somewhere in the neighborhood, as we've had for the past several years, of about 1,700 to 1,800 additional students. And the additional students that are going into our charter schools actually would be larger than the total projected student enrollment increase across the district. And so we don't have anything included, for that reason, we don't have anything included for additional teaching positions, because there will be no projected student growth for non-charter schools. In fact, there will be a decline or a reduction in the number of students in the non-charter schools. Once we have a better handle on what those numbers might look like from our student assignment office, we'll begin looking at where we can make reductions in number of teachers based upon individual school student projections. But do want to point out that included in that $22–23 million number for charters, that is our growth. That is our student enrollment growth included in there for the 14-15 school year. And as Mr. Pinkston said, at the bottom part of the page, we do have some things that we feel are important that have previously been funded with grant funds, particularly Race to the Top funds, where those funds will no longer be available. And we have some items included that were included in the budget proposal last year that didn't make the final cut. And so over the years, we've had growth in our Gifted and Talented program. We've had a need for additional school psychologists. We've had a need for additional exceptional education teaching positions, for parent outreach translators. Those didn't make the final cut last year, and so they were just carried forward and included in this estimate here, again, subject to further discussion as we move along in the budget process. Any questions about the summary of changes, again, knowing that this is early September and this is our best estimate at this point in time? Regarding item number 2, Dr. Register, do you want to take the lead there, and I'll be glad to jump in.
Maybe before we shift, a quick question. I'm curious on the revenue projection and why we would look at carrying the same rate of growth as we had in the prior year, particularly around property tax income. When we look at property tax income and building permits, we hear often that Nashville's hot, right? People are moving to Nashville. They want to be here. We're seeing growth in the schools because people are moving here. We've seen a significant increase in building permits in the last 36 months, which indicates, I think right now for 2013, we've got about $1.7 billion in active development occurring. If we look at 2009, it was around $1 billion or $1.1 billion. It typically takes about 2 years for that to add to the tax roll. So it would point to a pretty significant increase next year, 2 years, and 3 years from now in metro government property tax collections just based on the building permits. I'm wondering if you thought about that, looked at that.
Yeah, so I'll take the answer there, and I'm the one that picked the 2% number. Again, as I said in my remarks, it's a fiscally conservative number. I think basing the rate of growth based on what we're getting this year is a sensible starting place, but let's just assume it's 3% instead of 2%, then that throws off a little over $22 million, so we still got a deficit either way. So like I said in the remarks, hope for the best, plan for something else, but happy to, if you want to kind of plan on a 3% scenario. I would like to, if we're going to be planning in a 3% direction, get a commitment from the mayor's office that we will, in fact, get at least 3% in budgeted, and I'm happy to have that conversation with you, with them, if you want to go forward that way.
Thank you. Do you think, Dr. Register, too, you could talk a little bit, and this is, over the last 3 years, we've talked a lot about Race to the Top, and that we were planning for all of that to go away. Now, we don't have a huge impact here, $3 or $4 million from Race to the Top and things that were federally funded, and we've had a lot of pressure in federal funds. Do we anticipate, I guess we've talked about the fact that we were trying to train our own staff to do a lot of this work so that we wouldn't have recurring revenue after the end of the grant. Why we're seeing that today and what that looks like 2, 3, 4 years from now?
Well, we put it in perspective. Race to the Top was $40 million. And so what we've tried to do is to identify the high yield strategies that we want to continue. And there are a number of examples of those strategies that we're really interested in continuing. So the bottom line is when the $40 million's gone, we have to pick that up with some other type of funding. We are actually writing a proposal for round 3 now, Race to the Top grant. As you know, we were a finalist last time, but we weren't funded. So we have that going on. Title I federal programs have not been reauthorized. We actually picked up some funding just in the last few weeks from our final allocation. That's a flow through to schools. We were able to increase schools' allocations there for staffing and other things that they use in providing instruction. But the bottom line is, if once all the Race to the Top funds gone, if there are programs that we want to continue, we'll have to add those back to the budget. We've really tried, our plan was to have those transitioned over by the time the money was gone, but because of the federal reductions and tight budgets, we haven't been able to move as much of that as we'd like to. And you can see these strategies that are listed here that we consider to be high yield strategies.
Do we think a lot of these are going to carry on for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, or it's a one-time or 1 or 2 year budget item? Data coaches, data warehouse staff, et cetera, being the biggest line item.
Well, we're data coaches and we're really looking at ways to restructure that program so that we can incorporate it into our federal programs budget, but we don't have an answer for it yet. The other strategies that we have there, some of them are ongoing. The Gifted and Talented program, that needs to be funded on a recurring basis. Some of the other things, the psychologists, health services, et cetera, are all that's a program enhancement or service delivery that we really need to continue just to serve our community, just to serve our kids. Race to the Top personnel, it's about, overall, it's about $2 million now, and we're pleased to have it that low because we funded a lot of soft funding positions initially, and we've either eliminated a lot of those or we've reduced them down to a bare minimum. At the height of the Race to the Top funding, we were budgeting about $10 million a year. So this $2 million is what's left of that we haven't been able to cover or eliminate. Be glad to give you a more thorough report on that. If you'd like to see that, you know, we can detail that by line item. I'm just not prepared to do that tonight. Didn't
If there's some
anticipate a
time,
question.
sometime in the next couple of months, I'm curious because we've talked about it.
Yeah, I think the report already exists, and we can send it to you.
Do you think, as we move into discussion of fiscal options, will you discuss a little bit about fund balance? We've got a pretty significant, I personally feel both with growth and fund balance, we don't have a big challenge in 14, 15. You know, as I've talked about calendar and a multi-year calendar approach, I feel the same way about the budget. I'd love to see a much longer-term projection and have a much more collaborative conversation with the mayor's office and council around our long-term needs. We're a growing school district. You know, we're adding 1,500, 2,000 kids a year, and the projection is to continue to grow. I feel, and I've expressed this to many of my colleagues, that if we actually get our job right, which I think we will, if we make Metro Nashville Public Schools the first choice, we're going to capture market share. There are about 30+ thousand kids in private school in Davidson County. If we have a 2 or 3 or 4% shift, it's going to drastically change our growth projections. I think Chris Weber does a great job with growth, but as a community, we have a much bigger conversation on growth to have and what the cost of public education is.
Yeah, and I'll come back to the fund balance, and I'll get Chris to help me with that. But one thing I will point out is that as we grow and as the community thrives, our property tax base is going up. Remember that only about a third of our budget is only about a third of our revenue budget is based on per pupil. So as our per pupil increases, property tax, sales tax is not affected by that directly. So as we grow faster, then hopefully the county will continue to grow at that rate or faster yet, so that we can continue to increase the per pupil expenditure. But only the BEP portion of our budget's really funded based on a per pupil expenditure basis.
And we usually see a bit of at least a 1 to 2 year lag with property tax growth. And right, when you build a new house, it takes a year or two to get it on the, or a new office building, a year or two to get on the tax roll and actually get the collection. So there's certainly some pressure.
And our fund balance has gone up, and it's gone up again this year. But Chris, you want to speak to fund balance, if you will, and how that process works?
And actually, before we leave the revenue side of the equation, I think it's important to recognize that just because we're 42% of metro government on a financial basis, that doesn't mean we're going to get 42% of new revenue. I mean, there's a lot of other decision makers in this process. So just even if tax receipts are climbing, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean they're all going to break in this direction. Right. Mr. Ransom?
Sure, and again, I'll reiterate some numbers that I shared with you back on at our August 13th meeting. As a reminder, our local revenues are projected and estimated by Metro Finance. Those projections are provided to us, and we were fortunate to collect more than was projected for both property tax revenue and local option sales tax revenue. Property tax revenue exceeded projections by around $8.2 million. Local option sales tax revenue exceeded projections by $6.6 million. So we had about a $15.5 million overage as far as actual collections over projections, which means we collected a little over 102% of our total revenues. On the expenditure side, we spent almost 99% of our budget, which is pretty close. So we were able to add to the fund balance between the revenue that was collected over and above the projections and spending a little less than what was budgeted. Our current fund balance number is around $76 million, which is 10.2% of our operating budget. The Metro policy is to have a minimum of a 5% fund balance. But we currently stand at around $76 million.
So we've got about 35 million. If we wanted to take it down to 5%, we have around 35 million to spend.
That would be the discretionary amount.
I think it's really important to also note the constraints on the use of unrestricted fund balance. So, Chris, if you would review those too, please. How do we gain approval to use that fund balance, and what are the restrictions of state law on the use of that?
The only restrictions regarding state law as it currently exists would be that you can only budget fund balance the amount that exceeds 3%. And so, which is a large amount for us, but you can only budget fund balance as a funding source for your budget at the amount that exceeds 3%. As far as actually including fund balance in the budget, that would be something that would need to be recommended by the Metro Finance Director and the Mayor's Office, and ultimately approved by the Metro Council as part of the budget process. If the board wanted to actually utilize fund balance during the fiscal year for certain items, that would require the board's approval and the approval with the approval of the Metro Council with the recommendation of the Metro Finance Director. So there is a process in place if there is a need or a desire to utilize fund balance during the fiscal year, but it does require Metro Council approval. Typically, fund balance is one-time money. So typically, fund balance should be used for one-time, non-recurring expenditures, because that money typically is not going to be there again, even though we have seen a recurring theme over the last several years where our fund balance does get replenished because of over-collections on the revenue side and/or underspending on the expenditure side. But typically, the definition of fund balance will be that it's one-time money, and best practice would be that it needs to be spent on one-time or non-recurring expenditures.
Within the fund balance and the revenue side, are lease payments from charter schools or fees that we charge charter schools within that?
Those would be included in the revenue.
The revenue.
Yeah, the other revenue.
In the unbudgeted revenue that ends up in fund balance at the end of the year?
The latter.
The latter?
Yeah.
It ends up in fund balance.
Dr. Register, talk about, in terms of the fund balance, we've got some very big ticket items, one-time expenditures on the horizon for technology and other things. Talk through what those look like and whether fund balance if that's where those dollars are programmed.
Yes, the technology increases due in large part to getting our infrastructure up to par for park testing, for implementation of Common Core. That's to be done online. We've got
which is a state mandate, right?
State mandate, about a $20 million expenditure, and I think we're whittling away at that. We've really tried to. We actually used some fund balance this year to do some purchases, but that's not a last-minute expenditure that we can make. We need to be working on that by 2015. We have to be ready to do that, and that's a big one. The other things are not mandated like that, but I think that technology budget is a big upgrade for us. That's in our face right now. Chris, you might have some specifics on that.
I don't have numbers regarding what the IT needs are as it relates to the state-required park testing, but I do know that that's something that a lot of school districts across the state are utilizing fund balance for, would be both infrastructure and actual computing devices for student use.
Do you see that transferring? We've talked a lot, and Mr. predecessor, Ms. Simmons, often argued to move technology into the operating budget from the capital budget. So we're talking tonight about the operating budget and potentially using fund balance for the operating budget. Do you see us trying to shift technology away from capital? Because historically we have treated it as capital, which is a separate process. Yeah,
we actually fund technology from both sources. We've actually had an expenditure or a capital line item, and Chris will have to identify the amount. We have that plus the operating budget, and we really fund technology improvements out of both.
Do we have any restrictions as far as how we spend the dollars, either state, accounting, other reasons we can't use operating dollars for capital expenditures?
No, and currently included in the operating budget would be more of your day-to-day operations for IT, which would mainly be staff, software. There is some networking included in the operating budget, but typically your large equipment type purchases are included as capital. Not that they couldn't be in operating, it's just a matter of, with the total dollar amount that we're giving, that we are given, what can we include in there? And typically the larger capital type items are included in the capital budget process.
Is that need, and you may know this, but does that need in 2 years, 3 years, a year for all the new hardware?
Ongoing every year between now and the time we implement Common Core and part testing. And I think, and it's really a misconception to say that, to think that it'll be over then. If we stay abreast of technology changes and improvements, I think we're looking at an annual investment there. But the last figure I saw on getting us ready to do part was $20 million. I think it's some less than that now. I think, Chris, we got a couple of million from the state, I believe.
We had approved this year $10 million in the capital budget for technology, and then the state, through a special appropriation for all school districts, we got an additional $2 million. So a total of $12 million this year for technology.
So just being mindful of time, we need to talk about options. We've also got a brief executive session that we need to do prior to the 5 o'clock board meeting. So can we come back if we have enough time to any additional questions and move on to number 2 on the agenda, Dr. Register, discussion of options.
This is not an easy subject to broach, and particularly this early in the year, but I'll make an attempt, and I'll ask Chris to help me with this. We looked at several, when you're talking about making fairly significant reductions in expenditures, there aren't many places to go besides staff. We've looked at, we would look at reducing staff across the board where we could. And I'll refer you back to last year's budget. Last year we cut 44 positions in the budget. We added about 85, and a lot of those 85, and that's a current figure, and a lot of those 85 are classroom teaching positions that we had to add for growth that we had planned into the budget. About 40 of those, or teaching positions that we've added after school started because of growth in different schools. We've had to add quite a number of those. We did cut 21 central office staff last year. That's about a 7.6% reduction. When you look at administration, central administration of the entire district, we're at about 275 positions now, give or take a few, depending on how you count those, but that's out of about 10,000 employees. We would go back to that and start there and look at ways that we could streamline our operations. We also have to understand that when we cut those positions, we're also cutting services, and I think, but we'd take a very good look at that. The place where we have class size flexibility is most apparent in grades 7 through 12, where we have staffed academies and small learning communities and common planning time and 4x4 or block scheduling, if you will. It takes extra positions to do that. I'm not in favor of making those cuts, but that's where we can have an impact on class size. At the elementary level, we're tight. We're staffed up to what the state requires us to have. Some other area, 2 or 3 other areas of consideration. One is to look at school consolidation, and we've had a number of conversations about this. One thing that we prepared for you today is to just give you a list of schools that are under 70% utilized now. consolidating schools is problematic. And it's when you start combining enrollments, when you start changing zoning and everything, it's a very complicated issue. And when you start closing schools in communities, the interesting thing about this chart is that there are only 3 elementary schools on this chart showing under 70%. The majority are middle schools, and then you have 3 high schools that are on the list. We chose 70% because that's consistent with the way the Pupil Assignment Task Force has, that's the line that they've drawn to really say that above 70% is not an underutilized facility, so we just borrowed that term. You can see on these schools.
Let me stop you there. Above 70% is not an underutilized facility is the assumption that you need to reserve some space in the facility to accommodate growth potential.
And program.
Okay.
And program. That's I guess an arbitrary figure, but it's been one that's been used by the Pupil Assignment Task Forces since its inception, I believe. When you look at these numbers, you can see that some of these schools are growing in enrollment. We have a couple that are declining. You have a number of small schools here, but the possibility for consolidation is one consideration there. The 2 other areas that I hesitate to mention, but I'll mention them because the amount of funding is fairly significant. One's to eliminate the enhanced options schools, and that's staffing and also extra time for those schools. And that goes back to the 1998 desegregation plan when those schools were created, but possibility for generating $2 or $3 million a year there. And then the last option is from the most recent zoning plan. The student assignment plan called for about $5 million in staffing plus $1 million in extra transportation. I think we have a real obligation on that transportation, maybe some flexibility in the student assignment plan. And then the last thing that I don't have a dollar figure on is to consider possibility of outsourcing some services. It's not my recommendation that we do that. I think we've gained some efficiencies in operations, but it is something that we could consider and generate some savings in revenue. And those are the areas that we have identified now where we would have to look. Any time that we talk about making budget reductions, I think it's very important that we minimize the damage. And I hope that we're not in a situation of having to make significant reductions. I would like to make 2 other comments though. There are a couple of items that we'll ask you to look at and consider as we go forward that I think are very important. And one of those is strategic compensation. We've got a strategic compensation task force now that's working on teacher salaries. We want to recruit and keep and promote and develop the very best teachers that we can, and a part of that has to be a strategic compensation plan. That's actually in the new state law also, that we have to develop that. I hope that means that we want to work toward having the best salaries and that we want to work toward rewarding teachers for extra work and extra responsibility and those things. You know that 2 years ago we made what I thought was a giant step in raising our beginning salary very significantly. We went up from in the middle of the pack, if you will, in the state to close to the top in beginning salary. But there are other things that need to be done there. That committee's working. We're on a timeline to finish that task force report to you by November, and we'll be able to give you some information about that and the financial implications of that. A strategic compensation plan doesn't necessarily have to mean increase, but I think when you put that with looking at, we want to have the best salaries because we want to have the best teachers for our children. I think that's something that we have to consider. And then the other thing that I think is very important for an urban school system, and I'll say this now, and you'll hear me say it all year, is universal pre-K. 72% of our children live in a state of economic deprivation. Most of those children do not have access to free pre-K, and I think that's an issue that this board and we should consider. I'll point to Memphis now. Memphis is actually having a tax referendum. They may have already had it. If they did, it was just this week. But a tax referendum to raise taxes to provide universal pre-K for all the children in Memphis. And our children, we serve, and I'm sorry I don't have the specific numbers for you now. I will get that for you. But we serve a much smaller percentage of our 4-year-olds than we would really like to serve. And also special needs kids. You know, we try to provide universal pre-K for, would like to provide that for special need children also. So those are two areas that I think will be a budget pressure. Mr. Pinkston, you asked me at the last work session, the last time we talked about this, what were the big ticket items that were coming? And you surprised me with that question, but you didn't ask it tonight, but I'm telling you tonight, giving you an answer to what you said last time. I think those are very important issues that we need to address.
Yeah, and so when I was saying earlier that that 38 million number could go up, I mean, I think pre-K is a ripe opportunity for increased expenditures if we think that there's political will in the community to accommodate it. I'd love to bring, you know, the state has basically stopped funding growth in pre-K, which I think is a big mistake. But we happen to have in this community one of the state's leading pre-K advocate, Vice Mayor Diane Neighbors, and I'd love to bring her into this conversation to engage her on this issue in a more direct way. I think that could be a very powerful thing, but it's going to cost money.
Did the school board of Memphis vote for the referendum and then have the referendum placed on the ballot, or how did the referendum get to the ballot?
To place a referendum on the ballot, you have to, I expect the school board, I don't know what role the school board played in that, but I know their council, their Metro Government Council had to put that on the referendum.
I guess about one other budget item as well. 2 years ago, Metro Nashville discussed buyout options. You and I and Mr. Henson had a really brief, probably 2-minute conversation around it as an option if we weren't fully funded. I'm wondering if that is something that you would contemplate this time around. And I think about staff that have been with us for 20 plus years, given their career, given a whole career to us, who are also really expensive. I also am very excited about your new human capital division and their capacity, and see that as a potential win-win, where we could spend one-time money for buyouts, replace really expensive staff who want to participate with younger staff, perhaps first-year teachers who our new human capital division recruits, as an option. Is that anything you're thinking about?
Well, it's really hard to quantify that. I've done it twice before in other districts. And this is my personal experience. And so what I recognized was an initial outlay. There is the cost. You could use fund balance to do that. The returns are long-term, but I've never been able to quantify that to say precisely how much that was. Chris, you may have a reaction to that. Or a response for Mr. Hayes, but I don't really. It would be very difficult to quantify, but it's very possible that we could generate some savings from that.
We know how many employees we have with more than 15 or 20 years of service, and we know what it costs to hire a new employee. Now, we don't know how many might choose to participate.
Yeah, I think we did something similar a number of years ago, maybe 8 years ago. I think something that could be done, as you said, the initial outlay for the cost of the buyout, that's a perfect, not perfect, that's obviously a use of fund balance, and that's what Metro government did this past year. And it really depends upon how you tailor, how you structure that buyout. And then you just have to apply estimates to determine how many do you think, based on best estimates, how many do you think might take advantage, and then what the replacement costs would be and what the generated savings might be. It's all going to be a series of estimates until you know how many actually took advantage, and then what the costs were to hire the replacements. But it's something that school districts use, something that governments use, and of course, this past year, Metro government went ahead with their program. So it's not something we haven't done before, but as Dr. Register said, it's a little difficult to quantify, particularly on the front end, because it's all estimates, how much could possibly be saved. But it's something that is used as both a cost-saving measure and as, in some cases, particularly at Metro government, as a good way to reorganize certain departments.
We've got our human capital staff involved in that strategic compensation study, and perhaps we can incorporate that. I don't see anybody here from. Derek's back there. He's smiling at me. But that's an add-on. But that might be a very appropriate place to look at potential savings there if we did that, and it might help us pay for a strategic compensation plan.
Is there a way, so I've been through this at the state level doing early retirement and incentive buyouts, but is there a way to survey some portion of the workforce just to get a sense of whether there'd be interest, or is that just too complicated?
I think I think you have to be pretty concrete with what you're going to offer. It's premature, I think, to do that now. I think the best thing to do now would be to look at the demographics of our workforce and try to make some predictions that way. And then a little bit later, if we're really serious about that, would be to put out a survey and find out how many people are really interested in leaving. As a general rule, I think our number this year was close to 600 new hires this year. So we've got a fairly high percentage of turnover, 600 new teachers, licensed personnel. So we've got a fairly rapid turnover now. What I'll do for a follow-up for you for next meeting is give you a demographic breakdown of our employees, and maybe we can take that as a launch point for a further conversation.
So why don't we pause? Other questions from other committee members about these options that Dr. Register's laid out?
I'd like to add another budget pressure. And we've been talking about, last year we raised teacher salary to $40,000, but that didn't go down. There was no domino effect. So teachers with experience, with multiple years of experience, didn't get a pay raise resulting from that. And we know that our very best teachers are often our teachers with higher degrees and with more experience. So I think that's another budget pressure. I know of a teacher that just recently came to Metro from Williamson County. She had to take a $7,000 pay cut and, from a neighboring system with a lot less problems than we might have here in Metro schools.
Right, and what we've done, we really had a two-phase plan on salaries, and we weren't able to implement the second phase. The first phase was to cut the bottom off the salary schedule, to raise the beginning pay from about $35,000 to $40,000, and by the way, that strategy really helped us recruit new teachers and people coming in. But the second part of it was to compress, and that compression was to get to the top faster, which would address the people that you're talking about. And there's a lot of research that says that from up to about 10 years you're getting better, or 15 years. We have a 25-year process, steps that run for 25 years, not every year when you get to the upper ends, but to actually be able to get to the upper end, to the top end of the scale faster, which really adds to lifetime earnings for teachers, and I think that's the second phase of this that I think addresses the that you were talking about. Now, whether that's going to be a part of the Strategic Compensation Committee remains to be seen.
Other questions?
I had a question about federal funding and the fund balance. Are there guidelines that do we always utilize all of our federal monies? Or does it go back to the federal programs for the following year, or does it go in the fund balance?
Dr. McCarger is here. I'll try to answer it, and you come up here if I don't answer it adequately. We're required to keep all of the federal programs funding in a separate fund. And so instead of a fund balance, it's typically called carryover funding. And that carryover funding stays within the federal programs fund. It does not come over to the general purpose operating fund. So it does stay within that federal programs fund, and it can be reallocated the next year.
Following year?
Ms. Kim?
Yeah, so so I'm hearing all of the items that are listed out in the potential buckets, and I'm sure there's more. It sounds like these are the big ones in your mind. It is admittedly hard for me as a board member, like looking at them each in isolation, to know what is the best set of choices for the district. And that's partly in part because I'm not sensing like a cohesive, unifying vision that's going to help us make decisions. And so I'm feeling the need to just get on the same page with the broader board about what is our philosophy, what are we trying to optimize for, which I know I've said this before. But I think that that could lead to some very different decisions, number one. It could certainly help us decide within each of these buckets where we want to go, what needs to get prioritized for cuts, what doesn't, et cetera. So I would love to have that discussion so that we don't get too caught up in sort of line item-y stuff. I mean, obviously it does eventually boil down to some line in a spreadsheet, but I think it's more about the just global philosophy of what we as a board value. Because once we have that, and if we all agree on that, then I actually feel quite confident that the team, you know, you as our one employee are going to go back with your team and then figure out, in alignment with that philosophy, what is the best set of things then, the best recommendations that you want to put forth to meet that philosophy. As opposed to us getting to the business of, as a board, saying, okay, let's actually go through these line items sort of in, yeah, when they're not tied, when they're so separate. So that's one thought, is a desire to have that conversation about the guiding philosophy for how we want to think about the budget. But the biggest thought is actually around the opportunity that we have as a board to really take our operations and our outputs and our achievement to a wholly different level. Because now that we've laid out, you know, this incredible set of goals and have declared in the strategic plan for the first time ever that we want to be the best urban district in the country, this is huge leverage to help us get there, is just how we spend the money. And so there is, you know, a broader conversation, but before we get too caught up in what already is, you know, and the way we think about it and the various lines and the way they're all allocated at the moment, is just to have the big picture conversation about how can we use this budget to really drive student achievement so that we're positioned then to hit the big, impressive, ambitious goals that we've set for ourselves. So, and I'm really excited to have that. It's just, yeah, I mean, and hear from other colleagues, like how we're,
Yeah, so
and then there's no time.
I agree and I disagree. Having been through a bunch of really difficult state budgets, I mean, at the end of the day, you're just constantly monitoring cash flow and you're trying to adjust to make your resources stretch the farthest. So I think it is totally the right conversation to have about looking to high leverage areas of the budget that can throw off the most cost savings if we're looking at a budget shortfall. So I just think that's an unavoidable conversation. I think what you're talking about is the kind of vision within the budgeting process. So Dr. Register and Mr. Henson, maybe this is a time to talk about the kind of the school-based concepts that are being talked around internally.
Yes, Chris, you want to speak to autonomy of budgets and school-based budgeting?
Sure. And again, some of this will be repeat from what you've heard, but just to reiterate, we do currently have a pilot of 17 schools that are participating in what we're calling school-based budgeting, where they have basically a pot of money that they determine how they want to best utilize those resources to meet their goals and objectives based upon their school improvement plans. Knowing that there are state laws relating to class size that have to be met and other things, they do have a great amount of discretion and flexibility. We're looking to increase that number of schools after this year to probably within the 50 and 60 number of schools range next year. And ultimately, this would be a 3-year process where we hope to have all schools operating this way within the 3-year time period. And coinciding with school-based budgeting is a process where we are hoping to employ some outside expertise, particularly a company called ERS, Education Resource Strategies, very well-known experts, have worked with a number of large urban districts across the country as they have transitioned to student-based and weighted student-based funding. And so we're looking to go that route and coincide the weighted student-based funding with the school-based budgeting, and that would give the district an opportunity to distribute resources more equitably based upon student needs, and also providing that autonomy or flexibility for our school leaders to determine how best to utilize the resources that they have to meet their goals and objectives, again, stated in their school improvement plans. And we're looking to push more and more and more of those resources out to the schools, keep less and less and less of those here centrally. And it's a process, and it's going to take some time, particularly with the number of schools that we have, but that's our genuine intent.
Ms. Kim, does that get close to kind of where you were aiming?
That's helpful. That's great. I mean, I love to hear that. I know that's been ongoing discussion, and I think that is on the right track. There's something, though, I mean, so when we think about, like, right, we had a bunch of schools this year in the district who performed at extremely high levels, both traditional, charter, magnet, of all types, no matter what the legal designation. And it feels as though, like, one part, and when I say, like, okay, I think we probably all generally agree that optimizing for student achievement is what we're here to do. Like, this is our charge as a board. We're trying to meet these big goals for the good of our kids. And when I think, though, about how we're going to get there, like that path, right, which requires expenditures and investments, is so important. And I know this is stating the obvious, but I could imagine, like, you could get through an entire process and not actually deal with that central question of what, if we picked out the top 15, 20 schools this past year, what in fact are the, hallmarks of success at those schools? Like leadership, exactly. Like, I'm sure there's a bunch of different things, but we may all agree on all of them, I'm not sure. But it seems that then our charge, that's like it's a case study unto itself that should then somehow inform this broader conversation about the 780, the $800 million that we have at our disposal to drive greater achievement across the district. And so I'm dying to have that conversation too, just about quality. And the reality is that, we do have right now a couple thousand kids who are sitting on wait lists, at magnet schools, at charter schools, at various choice schools across the district. And we've got the 30,000 who have opted out entirely that Mr. Hayes spoke of earlier. And I just feel like they're, like, within that broader context as well. I mean, what we do as a board matters so much in terms of really creating, the kinds of schools that our entire community gets behind and wants to enroll their kids in. And we have had success, this past year in particular, in some cases outstanding, whopping success. And so it does feel like that has to be so central in all discussions then about investments. That's the main.
So part of that is included in the strategic plan. And I think tying, when you look at equity and weighted pupil funding schemes, and you tie that to the strategic plan and try to quantify that in costs for implementation of the strategic plan, that's very important. I didn't go into talking about low-performing schools in terms of program utilization, enrollment capacity, the underutilized schools, because it's a little bit premature, but we're ready to come out with a third year of our academic performance framework. We should have that by the end of this month. And I think that'll certainly come into play as we consider those schools that are low performing, and are there decisions to make about those schools.
Ms. Shepherd?
I have a question, I think, for you, Mr. Henson. It might be in the weeds just a tad, but as far as these schools that have the autonomy and they are participating in the school-based budgeting, I'm sure they must have some type of oversight and some type of guidance. Can you talk to what that might look like for those schools?
Yeah, there's a training component that goes along with that. There were some training videos and a manual that those principals utilized, and also some support. But as we move forward and start to multiply these schools exponentially to get up to the total number, there's going to be a need for a lot more of that, a lot more training and a lot more support, and we'll have to look at resources that might be available or not available to do that. But that we've got a good template in place which basically allows them to budget their dollars without going over their total allocation, and so it keeps them within their total allocation. And we also have some guardrails. I hate to use that term, but we've got some guardrails regarding class size, so that we're sure that they're not going to exceed the state law as it relates to class sizes. But other than that, it's pretty much left up to them, and they have to make sure that how they're utilizing their resources matches the individual needs of their school.
And they were given the guidance primarily, to be able to participate in that.
Correct, and that mainly, in a lot of ways, is through their executive lead principal.
Okay, all right, thank you.
A couple more questions, and then we probably need to wrap this segment up to be continued. But Ms. Spearing?
Thank you. To add to what Elisa said, I have a lot of passion to investigate the starting time for high school. And the research is so clear that our high school students are not awake at 7 o'clock in the morning. And the schools that have changed the starting time for high schools till later in the morning, maybe 9 o'clock, have found that their scores went up in high school just by the sheer fact the kids are awake. And so I think this might be a good time to think about how would that impact transportation. Would we use MTA to help us with that? That might be the transportation seems to be a roadblock. So, yeah, I think this is.
Did you, you must have cued Jay Steele to come in right now. Because Jay's talked so much about the need to separate high school transportation from the other, and I think that's very important. Let me be very briefly explain what we have now. We have a three-tiered transportation system. We have about 600 buses that are in service, 600 routes that run 3 times a day, and that's special ed and regular ed too. And so, it's I'll oversimplify this, but about an hour to transport high school students, and then about an hour to transport middle school students, and then about an hour to transport elementary students. And special needs kids are mixed in with that group. This is something that comes up regularly and is discussed, and the typical short response is older children need to be on the streets before daylight waiting on buses, not younger children. So we've never, in this district or in other places where I've been, and in this district before I got here, never made the decision to put young children out real early. I think the switch would have to be between middle and highs. If you were middle's last, high school's first, if you reverse that somewhere or other. But the other thing that I think is very important that's would be a priority for us is to go more toward an open enrollment where any student in Davidson County could choose their high school based on program. We have arguably the best high school reform initiative in the country, and I think you're beginning to see the results of that. And if we could somehow or other separate high school transportation and develop a system that would allow students to move, to be transported around the county, that would be a real challenge. We've had conversation going on about that for the last 2 years. MTA, Paul Ballard is a great partner to us, and we're talking about that, but there there's some restrictions and limitations on what we can do there. But I think as time goes on, as we institutionalize our high school programs, as more kids want to go to more different places and make choices, we really need to push that concept. And that may be a possibility. I think it might cost more, though, than less, but I'm not sure.
We are at the bottom of the hour. I know we've got other things that we need to do tonight, so we want to keep the rest of the evening on track and on schedule. So before we close up here, just observe that there are obviously going to be multiple additional conversations as we get toward the next proposed budget. But Madam Chair, any parting thoughts?
No, I think it's going very well, and I do appreciate all of the information that's come before us tonight. The most interesting thing to me, when we start talking about budgetary options, and it's going to be difficult. It's not going to be anything that's going to be easy for anyone, especially when we consider how deep into our pockets we're going to have to go. So great job.
Thank you. A couple of last thoughts. As a next step, I'd like to recommend that we reach out to our counterparts on the Metro Council Budget and Finance Committee and the Council's Education Committee to schedule a joint work session so that they can hear about these potential options. I think we need to just get others in the community into this conversation and help educate people about what the possibilities are. So without objection, I'll be reaching out to Councilman Stein, who's the new Budget Committee Chair, and Councilman Glover, who's the new Education Committee Chair, to discuss the possibility of a joint session in the near future. Also like to consider inviting Mayor Dean and House Speaker Beth Harwell, who has taken an interest in the council and the school system, to participate in the next set of talks. They've obviously participated in the shiny part of education reform, which is creating the new stuff, but the harder part, the messier part, frankly, is the work ahead. We're really going to need their leadership and support to accomplish what needs to happen here. And also talk to Vice Mayor Neighbors about our pre-K potential. I think she's, like I said earlier, the leading advocate in the state for early childhood education. The fact that she happens to be in our city, in our Metro Council, is a tremendous untapped resource, and we need to be talking with her more often about those opportunities. So with that, anything else?
Can I have 2 sentences?
Yes.
I just want to thank you, Will, for the work that you have done and for leading the Budget and Finance Committee. You come to us with such a rich background with state government, so thank you for the job you're doing.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. All right, so no further business. We stand adjourned. I don't like to gavel, but I'll. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Jill.
Sure.